president of America's Planned Parenthood Federation maintains that European women should stop having babies for the next 10 years.
Don't you think such a theory, such a radical theory, is antisocial?
On the contrary, it seems to me that it is more practical and humane.
What about the women who want babies now and in 10 years will not be able to have babies? More impractical, don't you think?
Oh, John, you do ask hard questions. I should think that instead of being impractical, it is really very practical and intelligent and humane.
But Mrs. Slee, in this country, having babies is the only thing left which is both unrationed and untaxed. Do you think we really ought to stop?
Well, I suppose a subject like that is really so personal that it's entirely up to the parents to decide. But from my view, I believe that there should be no more babies.
And now to our story. When Mrs. Margaret Sanger opened the first birth control clinic in the United States back in 1916, birth control was a dirty word. The police threw her into jail as they were to do 7 more times during her crusade, a crusade that still faces the reasoning but unalterable opposition of the Roman Catholic Church. That crusade kept Mrs. Sanger away from her children for long periods. It helped to break up her first marriage, and she suffered constant, harrowing social abuse. Mrs. Sanger, in view of all of that, let me ask you this first of all. Why did you do it? I realize that you had an intellectual conviction that birth control was a boon to mankind, but I'm sure that others have that conviction too. And so what I'd like to know is this. What events, what emotions in your life made Margaret Sanger a crusader for birth control?
Well, Mr. Wallace, it's hard to say that any one thing has made one do this or that. I think from the very beginning, I came with a large family. My mother died young, 11 children. That made an impression on me as a child. I was a trained nurse, went among the people. I saw women who asked to have some means whereby they wouldn't have to have another pregnancy too early after the last child, last abortion, which many of them had. So there's a number of things that are one after the other that really made you feel that you had to do something.
There are some other possible reasons that suggest themselves on reading your biography by Lawrence later. Your mother, as you say, died prematurely after bearing 11 children. She was born a Catholic, was she not?
She was born a Catholic, yes.
And your father was a sort of a village atheist who clashed with church authorities, and because of his atheism, his earnings dwindled under community pressure. You and your brothers and sisters were known as, quote, children of the devil, end quote. Could it be then that in part at least you were driven emotionally toward the birth control movement because of antagonism toward the church, because that was a way to fight the church?
No, I don't think I had anything of the kind in mind. I was what I would call a born humanitarian. I don't like to see people suffer. I don't like to see cruelty, even to this day. And in nursing, you see a great deal of cruelty and unnecessary suffering. At that time, there was no opposition as far as the church was concerned. Any church. It was mainly the law, the federal law and state laws that one had to think of. The church was not in my mind at all.
Well, in going after your motive then, and I will press you just a little bit more about that and then get to the specifics of this evening, but in your motive, in the movement, is it possible that the movement itself, the feeling of wanting to do anything that you felt was important, that perhaps that moved you a good deal? Because the fact remains that you led a movement against overwhelming pressures that stemmed back for centuries, and in doing so, according to your autobiography, you even left your first husband. And you wrote this to a friend, Mrs. Sanger. You said, "Where is the man to give me what the movement gives in joy and interest and freedom?" Now, what was this joy, this freedom that you craved?
Well, I don't remember that letter that was written, but I think that it was not a question of marriage at all. There was a certain satisfaction in doing something that was going to alleviate the sufferings of women in particular, and I was quite a feminist at the time.
Obviously.
And yes, and I naturally didn't want to see women take all the suffering of childbearing and of pregnancies. So it was a pleasure, in a sense, to think that you were striking at an archaic law, which it was. Put it on the statute books by Anthony Comstock some years ago, and no one had stood up against it. No one had tried to change the laws. And at that time, not even a doctor had a right to use the United States mails and common carriers for books, for learning, for anything that he had to do with this question. It was considered obscene. The whole question was considered obscene.
Mrs. Sanger, you have helped to spread the birth control movement not only here in the United States, but in Europe and the Orient as well. Why? Why is birth control of such vital importance internationally? Is it just to save women suffering? Is that the only reason in your mind?
Well, not entirely. The population question is a great concern today, and the rate at which the births come in we're saving them now. At one time, the children died. They didn't have the food. Today, our population all over the world is getting certainly better consideration and better conditions than they had at the time that I was there. I went to every country because I was invited. And I didn't go into the country myself. I was invited to go to Japan and to speak there, have 8 lectures on the question of birth control and peace.
Well, do you believe that birth control is essential if we want to keep millions of people across the world from starving? Is that your thesis?
Say it again.
Do you feel that birth control is essential to keep millions of people across the world from starving?
Well, I think that birth control, if you keep your population more or less static until you pick up your resources, certainly you'll prevent their starving.
Well, what's more important, birth control or picking up the resources?
Well, picking up the resources, there's just a limit to that, too. There's just so much. Take Japan. And she cannot feed. They've had the best experts come there when MacArthur was there. And the best experts have said they have 20 million more people than they can feed. She's got to be fed outside in some way. She's got to have that kind of help if she's going to keep from fighting.
But certainly around the world there is potential agricultural land that is not being properly used now. Just this past year, on May 21st, the New York Times summarized an important study of the world's food resources made by Professor James Bonner of the California Institute of Technology. Professor Bonner says the world is not using 1 billion acres of potential agricultural land, and he adds that if this land were used and present agricultural land were improved, the entire world could be fed adequately even if the population increased by 1/3 in the next 50 years.
Oh, Mr. Wallace, you hear so many fantastic things of what can happen, what may happen. This and that, I've heard it for the last 30 years at any rate, of what could be done, but it's never done. And the thing is, what is it now? What have we got today? A very distinguished woman spoke to me about Arizona, and she said, I wish you wouldn't talk about population. She said, all the population of the United States can be put in one state. And I said, what state? She said, Arizona. I said, did you ever hear of caliche? She didn't know that I was talking about a delicatessen or what. I said, well, caliche is harder than any rock, and it is about 3 inches below the ground, where it looks beautiful. It looks as if you could have food, it looks as if you could have corn or wheat or cotton, but as a matter of fact, you have to dynamite caliche out of the ground in order to have a little shrub, have a little grass or a few flowers. So many problems that when it comes to that. And the demographers, I never heard of anyone that would agree with that we could have another in the world. Another third.
Well, you say that originally the opposition was in all law, and you have to fight against that. Today your opposition stems mainly from where? From what source?
Well, I think that the opposition is mainly from the hierarchy of the Roman Catholic Church.
Of the Church. Well, now
hierarchy.
Of the hierarchy of the Church. You feel that the parishioners themselves, the lay people in the Church, are not against birth control?
I feel they come to all of our clinics just the same as the non-Catholics do. Exactly the same.
Well, let's look at the official Catholic position. Opposition to birth control. I read now from a church publication called The Question Box. In forbidding birth control, it says the following. It says, the immediate purpose and primary end of marriage is the begetting of children. when the marital relation is so used as to render the fulfillment of its purposes impossible, that is by birth control, it is used unethically and unnaturally. Now, what's wrong with that position?
Well, it's very wrong. It's not normal. It's not, it has the wrong attitude toward marriage, toward love, toward the relationships between men and women.
Well, the natural law, they say, is that first of all, the primary function of sex in marriage is to beget children. Do you disagree with that?
I disagree with it 100%.
Your feeling is what then?
My feeling is love and the attraction between men and women. In many cases, the very finest relationship has nothing to do with bearing a child. It's secondary. Many times we know that. You see your birth rate, you talk to people who have very happy marriages and they're not having babies every year. Yes, I think that's a celibate attitude.
Surely. A celibate attitude, but you agree that Catholicism, according to the tenets of Catholicism, they rule that birth control violates not only the Church's position, it isn't the Church's position, but they say that it violates a natural law, as I have just explained. Therefore, birth control is a sin, no matter who practices it. Now, the violation of the natural law, according, you certainly can take no issue with the natural law as the hierarchy of the Catholic Church regards it.
Well, I certainly do take issue with it. And I think it's untrue, and I think it's unnatural.
Well, let me ask you...
Everything bears it out that it's an unnatural attitude to take. And how do they know? I mean, after all, they're celibates. They don't know love. They don't know marriage. They know nothing about bringing up children or any of the marriage problems of life. And yet they speak to people as if they were God.
Let me ask you this question. Suppose a healthy, a well-to-do couple decide for some reason never to have children, use birth control all their lives. Would you say that your methods are being misused, Mrs. Sanger?
Now, if they were intelligent people, and they had some reason for thinking of children as a responsibility, or some disease that they might have that they wouldn't like to pass on to a child, and I think it would be a very unselfish attitude for them to take if there is a disease.
No, I say a healthy, well-to-do couple. A couple that just doesn't want children, and for that reason they use birth control all the way. Do you think that is a misuse of your methods?
I don't think it's a misuse. I think if they're intelligent adults, they must know what they want. They must manage their lives themselves. And certainly there's nothing birth control than there is in other things that you might deny yourself.
I've asked you your motives a little while ago at the beginning of the program, your motives in working for birth control as hard as you have for as many years as you have. You reject the principal Catholic argument against birth control as being totally invalid. What do you think is the reason, the motive of the Church in forbidding birth control?
You'd have to ask a Catholic that. I couldn't say what their motive is.
Well, you couldn't say officially what their motive is, but you certainly must have an opinion about it, Mrs. Sanger.
Well, I don't have much to do with the hierarchy, and I know that the people that come to our organization and want to have the same methods, or whatever it is that one can have to prevent pregnancy, that those women will say to us, we ask their religion very often, and they say, I am a Catholic, I was raised in the Catholic Church. My church is wrong on this. This is the one thing. I will never be anything else, but my church is wrong on this one thing. And that is said over and over and over again. So what the motive is.
But you won't hazard a guess.
I don't care to. Thank you.
May I ask you why? Now, I know that in private and actually in public discussions, I think, prior to this time, you have been willing to state your understanding of what the motives of the Church are, and now you would rather remain silent. May I ask you why?
Well, simply because I don't think that the Church has changed in its attitude. Some of the hierarchy have changed their attitude. You can't say the same thing that you might have said a year ago or 2 years ago, as to your belief or as to your opinion. And
have you heard it said that the reason that the Church is against birth control is because they want more Catholics?
I've read it.
Do you believe it?
Well, if you read their papers, where they point out Boston, that's what has happened in Boston and Massachusetts. They have simply outbred the Protestants, and they're in Boston and Massachusetts they have control. I've read that in their own papers.
Of course, the Church's answer, and I read now from a pamphlet published by the Redemptorist Fathers in Missouri, says as follows. It says that point of view about wanting more Catholics is nonsense. Quote, "The Catholic Church does not command Catholic husbands and wives to have even one child. The Church considers it more than normally meritorious for them to have no children, if they mutually and perpetually give up the use of the marriage rite for the love of God."
All right. I don't quote what they do. So I think that the question in my mind is that they do and order their own people to do as they wish. But I object to their having the same rules for people who are not the same religion.
Well, they believe, you see, that it is a natural law, not a Catholic law, but a natural law, and therefore a sin not just for Catholics, but a sin for all peoples. And I think that there are other religious groups, the very, very Orthodox Jews feel the same way about birth control. Let's look at another argument against birth control, Mrs. Sanger, published in Red Book magazine in March of 1956. It says birth control is a devastating social force which tends to weaken the moral fiber of the community. Immunity from parenthood encourages promiscuity, particularly when unmarried persons can so easily avail themselves of the devices. Do you doubt that?
I doubt it.
You do?
Certainly.
Then let me read from a news story in the Philadelphia Daily News on June 10, 1942. The story quotes you as urging the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps to give its members, quote, preventive measures against pregnancy, end quote. And you add, quote, abortion and illegitimacy are bound to result if the government doesn't recognize human nature, end quote. In other words, you were not advocating Christian morality, but rather ways for single women to avoid bearing illegitimate children.
Where was this taken from?
Philadelphia Daily News, June 10, 1942, direct quote from Margaret Sanger.
I doubt it. I don't believe I ever made such a remark.
Well, in the same vein, in your autobiography, which you cannot disavow, you wrote the following about sexologist Havelock Ellis. You said he's been able to clarify the question of sex and free it from the smudges connected with it from the beginning of Christianity. Now, what do you mean by the smudginess connected with sex, and why do you blame it on Christianity?
Well, there's many reasons, of course, to say we have more records of it than go on Christianity. And I think I was speaking of Havelock Ellis as having clarified the question of homosexuals, making the thing not exactly a perverted thing, but a thing that a person is born with, different kinds of eyes, different kinds of structure, and so forth. That he didn't make all homosexuals perverts. I felt that he clarified that to the medical profession and to the scientists of the world, as perhaps one of the first ones to do that. That's one of the things that I meant in that.
Miss Sanger, do you disagree that Catholics, or do you feel that Catholics should not have a right to have a say when the city administration contemplates spending their tax dollars on birth control or the dissemination of birth control information, something that Catholics believe is sinful?
They have a right to say what they...
Do you feel that they don't have a right to have a say when the city administration contemplates spending their tax dollars on birth control? For instance, here in New York, Catholics comprise about 45% of our population. They're the largest single group. Well, don't you think they should have the democratic right to lobby against having their money spent, their tax money spent, for something that they consider evil?
I suppose they have a right. They certainly do it. But so have the others. They're only 45% of the population. That is not the majority.
But they have a right to get up and...
Certainly. I'd have no objection to their having to say that, but I think we should have the same right. I say we, I mean non-Catholics.
Well, of course, this is a little bit at variance with something that you told our reporter earlier this week. You said earlier this week, it's not only wrong, it should be made illegal for any religious group to prohibit dissemination of birth control, even among its own members. In other words, you would like to see the government legislate religious beliefs in a certain sense.
Where these strange things come to that I said them, that's what I should like to know when.
Well, now, you know that my reporter spent a good deal of time with you. He's a very accurate young man.
Yes.
And this is a specific quote.
Well, I don't think that's quite that way.
What are your religious beliefs, Mrs. Sanger? Do you believe in a God in the sense of a divine being who rewards or punishes people after death?
Well, I have a different attitude about the divine. I feel that we have divinity within us, and the more we express the good part of our lives, the more the divine within us expresses itself. I suppose I would call myself an Episcopalian by religion, and there's many other. If you travel around the world, you get quite a bit of the feeling of all religions have so much alike in the divine part of our own being. And I suppose you just couldn't put that in a book, or you couldn't put it into a phrase or a sentence.
Do you believe in sin? When I say believe, I don't mean to believe in committing sin. Do you believe there is such a thing as sin?
I think the greatest sin in the world is bringing children into the world that have disease from their parents, that have no chance in the world to be a human being, practically. Delinquents, prisoners, all sorts of things just marked when they're born. That, to me, is the greatest sin that people can commit.
But sin in the ordinary sense that we regard it, do you believe or do you not believe?
Well, what would they be?
Do you believe that infidelity is a sin?
Well, I'm not going to specify what I think is sin. I've stated what I think is the worst sin.
Yes, but then you asked me to say what, and I said what, and you refused to answer me?
Yes, I don't know about infidelity. It has so many personalities to it, and what the person's own belief is. I couldn't generalize any of those things as being sin.
Murder is a sin.
Well, that's naturally if murder is a sin or not. It's a terrible act.
In just a moment, Mrs. Sanger, I'd like to ask you about another social problem here in the United States, divorce. Nearly 400,000 couples get divorced in this country each year. And I'd like to get your views on the cause and possible prevention of this problem. Now then, Mrs. Sanger, there are nearly 400,000 divorces or annulments in America each year. What, and this is hard to do in the short time, of course, that we have, what would you recommend to cut down our divorce rate?
Well, as a great many of our clinics are including in the work that they do in birth control clinics, having marriage counseling. So when the woman or the man come and complain of their marriage on the skids, we invite them to come and have special talks with some of our psychiatrists or others who are making a study of that all over the country, where we have about 500 clinics. They almost all include marriage counseling and marriage erection.
May I ask you this? Could it be that women in the United States have become too independent, that they've followed the lead of women like Margaret Sanger by neglecting family life for a career? Let me quote from your biography describing your second marriage to Noah Slee. Quote, in New York, Mrs. Sanger maintained every clause of their compact of independence. They had separate apartments, they telephoned each other for dinner or theater engagements, or passed notes back and forth. Would you call this a sound formula for marriage, Mrs. Sanger?
Different people, yes. It certainly was for me and for my husband. We had a very happy marriage consulting. He had different friends than I had, and I don't believe in forcing. Well, we were two adults, and forcing your friends on another person when they have an entirely different outlook. It worked out very well.
I know that it did.
Roe versus Wade has its roots here in Dallas. In March 1970, two Dallas attorneys filed a lawsuit in U.S. federal court on behalf of Norma McCorvey, a 22-year-old who wanted to terminate her pregnancy. The filing, Jane Roe versus Wade, argued that abortion statutes in Texas were unconstitutional and violated McCorvey's privacy under 5 constitutional amendments. In January 1973, a 7-2 Supreme Court decision in favor of Jane Roe ruled the Constitution protects the right to an abortion. The all-male justices found abortion was a fundamental right for a woman's life and future. Linda Coffey, now 80 years old, was one of the Dallas attorneys who argued the case.
It's bittersweet. I followed all the ups and downs for so many years. There's been times when I thought that it might be overruled.
Mr. Trump, you're pro-life, but I want to ask you specifically, do you want the court, including the justices that you will name, to overturn Roe v. Wade, which includes, in fact, states a woman's right to abortion?
Well, if that would happen, because I am pro-life and I will be appointing pro-life judges, I would think that that will go back to the individual states.
But I'm asking you specifically, would you like
to... If they
to...
overturned it, it'll go back to the states.
But what I'm asking you, sir, is do you want to see the court overturn? You just said you want to see the court protect the Second Amendment. Do you want to see the court overturn Roe v. Wade?
Well, if we put another 2 or perhaps 3 justices on, that's really what's going to be, that will happen. And that'll happen automatically, in my opinion, because I am putting pro-life justices on the court. I will say this, it will go back to the states, and the states will then make a determination.
Secretary Clinton.
Well, I strongly support Roe v. Wade, which guarantees a constitutional right to a woman to make the most intimate, most difficult in many cases, decisions about her health care that one can imagine. And in this case, it's not only about Roe v. Wade. It is about what's happening right now in America. So many states are putting very stringent regulations on women that block them from exercising that choice, to the extent that they are defunding Planned Parenthood, which of course provides all kinds of cancer screenings and other benefits for women in our country. Donald has said he's in favor of defunding Planned Parenthood. He even supported shutting the government down to defund Planned Parenthood. I will defend Planned Parenthood. I will defend Roe v. Wade, and I will defend women's rights to make their own health care decisions. And we have come too far to have that turned back now. And indeed, he said women should be punished, that there should be some form of punishment for women who obtain abortions. And I could just not be more opposed to that kind of thinking.
I plan to speak about our strategy for improving care for pregnant women and mothers across our country. And as you know, on the way here, however, we learned that the United States Supreme Court had rendered its decision in Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization. Here's what that decision means. For nearly 50 years, we have talked about what Roe v. Wade protects. Today, as of right now, as of this minute, we can only talk about what Roe v. Wade protected. Past tense. This is a healthcare crisis. Because understand, millions of women in America will go to bed tonight without access to the health care and reproductive care that they had this morning. Without access to the same health care or reproductive health care that their mothers and grandmothers had for 50 years. This is the first time in the history of our nation that a constitutional right has been taken from the people of America. And what is that right? Some might ask. It's the right to privacy. Think about it as the right for each person to make intimate decisions about heart and home. Decisions about the right to start a family, including contraception, such as IUDs, the morning after pill. Decisions about whether to have a child, including, as Senator Durbin mentioned, through in vitro fertilization. Decisions to marry the person you love. Obergefell v. Hodges. Loving versus Virginia. This opinion also says, when you read it, that abortion is not deeply rooted in our nation's history. They offer that, in the opinion, as a foundation for the decision they rendered today. In holding that, it is not deeply rooted in our history. Today's decision on that theory, then, calls into question other rights that we thought were settled, such as the right to use birth control, the right to same-sex marriage, the right to interracial marriage. The great aspiration of our nation has been to expand freedom. But the expansion of freedom clearly is not inevitable. It is not something that just happens. Not unless we defend our most fundamental principles. Not unless we elect leaders who stand up for those principles. The strength of our nation has always been that we move forward. Today, I invite all people to stand together in defense of one of the most fundamental ideals and principles that for generations, for centuries, I believe we had held dear, which is that fundamental principle about the importance of liberty. To stand for liberty, to stand for freedom, to stand for self-determination, and for the right to privacy. You have the power to elect leaders who will defend and protect your rights. And as the president said earlier today, with your vote, you can act, and you have the final word. So this is not over. God bless you, and God bless America.
Abortion is murder. I ask myself all the time, doesn't it seem to you that progressive policies always lead to regressive results in the black community? It's amazing, isn't it? Abortion, so progressive. They want to move that forward. We need abortion. We have black women representing 6 to 7% of the population, and yet we account for almost 40% of all of the abortions that are performed in this country. We have a sick and twisted Governor Andrew Cuomo celebrating that you can rip fetuses, you can rip infants and babies from their mother's womb at 9 months. 9 months. It's absolutely sickening what we're talking about here. And who is that going to impact the most? In New York City, for those of you that don't know, more black babies are aborted than born live.
Pro-life supporters have come in from all over the country, and their efforts have not been in vain. 5 years ago, in 2013, the number of annual abortions fell below 1 million for the first time in 40 years, and that number has slowly continued to drop. Of course, that means there are still roughly 1 million babies killed in the womb each year, with maniacal ghouls like Cecile Richards at Planned Parenthood snuffing out a third of them. Planned Parenthood alone has killed more than 7 million babies in the womb since Roe v. Wade. And as the Center for Medical Progress expose showed us, Planned Parenthood has profited marvelously by selling babies' body parts on the black market to the highest bidder. Since Roe v. Wade, well over 60 million abortions have occurred in the United States. To put that in perspective, that's the total population of South Carolina, Louisiana, Kentucky, Oregon, Oklahoma, Connecticut, Iowa, Mississippi, Arkansas, Utah, Kansas, Nevada, New Mexico, Nebraska, West Virginia, Idaho, Hawaii, Maine, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Montana, Delaware, South Dakota, Alaska, North Dakota, Washington, D.C., Vermont, and Wyoming combined. By 1972, the year before Roe v. Wade, when abortion was still illegal in the majority of the country, the actual number of women who died from illegal abortions was 39. Not 39,000, not 3,900. 39. The wilder statistic is that same year, 24 women died from legal abortions, despite legal abortion only existing in a small percentage of states. The mass slaughter has taken a disproportionate toll on racial minorities. In New York City, more black babies are aborted than born. This is no coincidence. Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, was a committed eugenicist who explained, quote, "To understand the difficulties and the obstacles to be overcome before the dream of a greater race in America can be attained is to understand something of the task before the women who shall give birth to that race. More than 100 million population are Negroes, Indians, Chinese, and other colored people to the number of 11 million. There are also 14,500,000 persons of foreign birth. There were 1,600,000 illiterate foreigners in the United States when the 1910 census was taken. Do these elements give promise of a better race? Are we doing anything genuinely constructive to overcome this situation?" That's from her book, Woman and the New Race. And they did get very constructive, reaching the climax during Roe v. Wade. Future generations will look on our tolerance of abortion with the same horror and moral opprobrium with which we view slaveholders in the antebellum South. Which side will that history record you as having taken?
Those who would argue that the 60s marked the end of the good old days, the end of family stability, the end of everything being predictable and comfortable, and that was when divorce went up, and that's when people started to question family life and all of those kinds of things, and that's when sexuality ran amok. And there are certain ways you can look at those indicators, but on the most basic level, what I think is important to understand is that the children of the 60s, baby boom children growing up, in some ways behaved a whole lot more like their grandparents than they behaved like their parents. So if we take the long view, what do we see happening in their grandparents' lives? Well, the grandparents grew up in the early decades of the 20th century. What happened then? Massive consumer revolution, a massive sexual revolution. The incidence, if we just want to look at premarital sexual intercourse, which is a very bad indicator of sexual activity, but the one that everyone is obsessed with. So if we want to just look at that, there have really been only 2 times in the last century that particular sexual behavior increased dramatically. One time was in the early 20th century, and the second time was in the 60s. So you have the children then, the grandchildren, behaving in a lot of ways like their grandparents. The divorce rate went up in both eras. Both eras were marked by an explosion of popular culture, new forms of public amusements, especially a powerful youth culture. So somehow the generation in between is what is really strange, and somehow in our popular consciousness we have dubbed them the normal, the traditional. There was nothing traditional about them. They were very bizarre and unusual by historical standards. So one way to look at the 60s is to say, well, the children of the 60s just went right back to the way their grandparents were and picked up and went ahead from there. So on some level, what happened in the 60s wasn't so dramatic. What were the pieces that were new? Well, if we want to look at degree, we could say, well, the divorce rate had increased dramatically in the early 20th century, leveled off in the 50s. In fact, it even went down. That was a very, very striking thing to happen. This sense of family solidarity was so powerful that the divorce rate, which had been going up forever, I mean, there was no, with the exception of the 30s for economic reasons, the divorce rate had really steadily increased. It suddenly flattens a little. Certainly, as far as I'm concerned, it had nothing to do with people being more happily married. It wasn't about that. But it was about some kind of commitment to that stable family unit. So what happens in the late 60s, of course, is a skyrocketing of the divorce rate that was unprecedented. Another thing that happens is a change in people's sexual behavior outside of marriage. An increase that was marked, and an increase in accepting attitudes about sexual behavior. But what's curious is that the opinion polls at the time show that people's behavior was changing faster than their attitudes. So that you would have college students, even in the early 70s, asked whether they had engaged in premarital sex. Again, a misnomer, because it assumes it was premarital. Who was to say whether it was premarital or just sex outside of marriage? So all of these terms, I think, are very loaded. But anyway, if they were asked whether they had done it, the vast majority said they had. If they were asked whether they approved of it, the vast majority of the very same group said they disapproved. So I guess the psychologists would call it cognitive dissonance. I would call it guilt.
I appreciate, believe me.
Well, one of the kind of tenets of the counterculture was kind of the freedom of sex, and partly brought on was by the pill, which was a very liberating course in the 60s. What did you think about that when you saw young kids?
Well, there again, you see, I'm from a different time and day. Not much far removed from these kids, but still a different time and day. And I couldn't believe it. To me, it was like shocking in a way, even though I'm a man, they say a man doesn't care as much as a woman and all this. But still, it was unreal to believe that this was going on.
Could you start all that and say what it is you're referring to?
Oh, I'm sorry. That's how I forget that. You talk about the sexual revolution, if you want to call it that. It was kind of shocking to me that all these things were going on, because my time of day, this was unheard of. You didn't talk about these things. Like, I used to kid around. I used to say I was 22 years old before I found out a prophylactic wasn't a toothbrush. And, we knew, but not like the kids were practicing what we knew, so to speak. And I guess they had grown one step, each generation goes one step beyond the next. So maybe that was their way of, going one step beyond us in one thing. And, of course, it shocked people of my category, age and everything. And it shocked most of us, but some of them even fell in with it. Some of the older people even fell in with it a little bit. I don't say completely, but a little bit. It must be because even the senior citizens were living together to keep the Social Security checks coming in. So they fell in with it real easy in a way. They had a reason, you see. But it's no good. I mean, it's too loose, and too many things can happen. A lot of children are born out of wedlock, and the guy takes off, goes Christ knows where, and the girl's left with the problem with the kid. Now, next thing you know, she can't make it in this world for some reason. She's not equipped with any kind of technical skills or anything to make a living real good. But anyway, so what happens? She falls into the framework of dependency on the government and everything. And so what happens? We're paying for it in the tax structure, see? So, I don't know, it's not good for a lot of other reasons too. It's not moral. If you're a religious person, it's not moral. I'm not the greatest religious person, but I still say it's not moral. I mean, I wouldn't want to see my daughter pregnant, not married. I don't guess anybody would.
Your daughter living with somebody and not married.
I don't like that either. I just see, I wasn't born. I'm not up with this sort of thing now. The kids all do it. Not all, but a lot of them do it. They live with each other. Even in colleges, the dorms are co-ed, all that sort of thing. It's just strange to me because I wasn't brought up that way. I was brought up, the boys stayed here, the girls stayed there. I mean, that was it. If you wanted to take a girl out, you take a girl out. You dancing, you take a girl out and everything. But you didn't live with them. I don't know of any guy in my crowd that ever lived with a girl. Really, in their 20s. Most of us were in our 20s and everything, and most of us got married about the same time. And we just never thought about things like that. Forbid, like, one night I got caught in a snowstorm over my wife. She was my fiancée at the time. Got caught over her house in a terrible snowstorm. Well, they had to put me up overnight. So I slept in the attic by myself, up in an attic. I didn't hear the end of it for 2 months. Everybody said I was sleeping with my wife in her room, you know, something like that. But, you know, it just, that's the way things were in those days. That was a scandal already. You know, everybody thought, man, this guy's terrible, you know. But now they don't even talk about it. It doesn't even bother anybody. I noticed the guys, some of the younger guys down at the company who drive the cabs, they talk about living with this girl and that girl, and, you know, they get the phone messages. Joanne says, call home right away. Now, Joanne normally would say your wife said to call home. He said Joanne said to call home. So that's not his wife. You see, you can pick that up real quick. And they're all doing it. So, I don't know. It just, I guess that started it off in those days, and it just led up till today. And like I say, even the senior citizens have gotten into the act. Theirs might be a little different reason, but they're still in the act. You know, they figure, well, the youngsters are getting away with it. We can do it too. You know, nobody will talk. And everybody excuses them because they feel sorry for them because they'd have to give up one Social Security check. So everybody gives them that excuse, you know what I mean? But, I don't know, I just couldn't do it. And I wouldn't want to see my daughters doing it either, really.
You know, you grew up in the 50s, or you were a young man.
In my 20s, yeah.
And now we're about to hit the 90s. I mean, what do you think about the different country you see today? What life values and expectations were in the 50s, and what kind of way we live today?
Well, in the 50s, we had big ideas, you know, that people were coming out of the war in the early 50s. They were primarily coming out of the war and depression all at once. See, because the depression was still going on when the war started. But people made some money during the war. They were able to buy homes. Then the government came up with the GI loan and that sort of thing for the veterans, and they bought a lot of homes. So it started giving everybody a lift, and people weren't so downtrodden. Then people start working on their kids, go to school, you know, get an education, you can do this, and all the kids went to school. School was cheap in those days. You could get in a lot of good colleges, reasonable, you know. And everybody had expectations they were going to set the world on fire. I mean, I was going to right everything that was wrong. Wasn't anything that I wasn't going to set straight. But you soon learn as you go along that it just doesn't work that easy. There's always those politicians right in your way that are going to stop it and put an end to it for some reason or another. I don't know what their reason is or what the cause is, you know, why they do it. But it seems that they all do it. They put the skids on everything that's good. A lot of times. I don't say everything, but...
How do you feel about politics today?
I'll tell you the truth. I wouldn't look at a politician from 5 feet away. I don't want to get that close to a politician at 5 feet. I just don't like it. I don't trust them. I don't have the confidence in them that I once had years ago. Today, we're getting too many scandals with these guys. I never heard of these kind of scandals years ago. Maybe they were better at hiding it in those days than they are today. And don't forget, the media today is so much faster than it used to be. We've got television, and just like that, you've got all the news you want. And they catch these people. And they got people out on the street to catch these people. The thing I don't understand about certain politicians, why they even want to be politicians. You take, a good example would be a guy like Rockefeller. Why did he want to be a politician? The guy had everything in this world. Maybe it's an ego trip, maybe it's power, maybe it's prestige to go along with what he already had. But he really doesn't need it. The Kennedys don't need it. I mean, you know, it's just odd the way that we get our politicians, where they come from. I think in the Congress, I don't know what the percentage is, but it must be around 80 or 90% of them are lawyers. And they claim that you have to be a lawyer to be in Congress to figure out the laws and so forth. I still maintain that we should have a better cross-section of the people in Congress. That we should have more diversified type occupations representing the people in the country. I mean, I don't see any carpenters up in Congress. I don't see any cab drivers up there, that's for sure. And I think they could be taught to handle the routine of Congress and everything, maybe with a little more practical sense, too. And see, the original forefathers, when you look at their occupations, they were what? Farmers, mechanics, doctor here and there, and different things like that. But they were well diversified. A few ministers of different faiths. They were scattered out. You know, it was more of a broad section of the population. And now they're all lawyers, and lawyers think in terms of law and legality and they make everything so complicated. And I think that's the trouble with some of our laws. They're so complicated we can't figure them out. You need another lawyer to figure out what the other lawyers are doing.
Let me ask you this. Do you see any ways that any effects of the 60s on us today, the kind of country we are today? What kind of legacy do you see it's left?
I'll be honest with you, I don't see any legacy that they did leave. I mean, the 60s, they had their controversy, but I think basically all it centered around was the Vietnamese War. I honestly believe that. That was the whole crux of the thing at that time. And they made up all their folk music and all the other things that they did. It all centered around that Vietnamese War. They didn't want to go in the Army or the Navy, whatever it might have been. But these guys, the men, didn't want to go into service, which, like I say, I can't blame them in a way because it was a lousy war. We shouldn't have been in it. But I think that's what the crux of the 60s was about. As far as leaving us anything today, I don't think they left us a thing but memories. That we remember all these things. Woodstock, like I said before, that was played up big, and I think they just had the anniversary of it or something like that. And I mean, what was it? I mean, it's just a good party. It was like a big party for a lot of them. And that doesn't leave any legacy. I mean, that's not a legacy to me. A legacy is when Franklin Roosevelt devised the Social Security Act. That's a legacy. He handed something down to the next generations. And you have something concrete that, you can hold on to. But I don't see where the 60s were a big thing for legacies, to hand down to this generation or this time and day. I just don't see it. I don't see anything that shows today from that period.
Looking back on it from today, I mean, do you see the 60s as just kind of a time of youthful folly and experimentation, or can you see some good parts of it?
Well, I see kids really were intelligent kids. They weren't dummies. Don't get me wrong. I mean, a lot of them were in colleges and things, going to school. But they were out for a good time, a lot of them. I mean, just like any college kid. What do they used to go to Fort Lauderdale in the spring break and they'd tear the place apart? That's a lark, you know what I mean? But some of them were on that. But they were intelligent enough to know what they were doing, a lot of them. And they had their leaders. What was it, the Chicago 7? Was that one bunch or something? I forgot all their names. And Hoffman, and that's the name that sticks out for some reason, Abbie Hoffman. But I think he was just in the news recently. Maybe that's what it is. But these people, they were the leaders, leading the troops on. And the troops were like cannon fodder. They just went anywhere they were told for the most part. And they're the ones that got it bad. And then the leaders, nothing happened to these guys. They went to jail, some of them, but yeah, wouldn't say they're going to jail nowadays. You go to a country club up north somewhere, and they stick you up there with guys used to be like Hoffman and them people. They don't do time. They pass time away in jail. You see, and these guys, nothing happened. And like I say, it didn't carry on to another generation or anything. It just, the only thing it carried on maybe is that some of the kids today still like to dress goofy like that. I call it goofy because I can't stand to see a kid with hair straight up the hair painted pink, purple, and blue. I mean, and I might be a little jealous because I don't have that much hair too. I mean, that might be one of the reasons. But no, I don't think it left anything for this generation. I see this generation of young people being a little different. I see them taking more of an active part in what's going on. They're not as sloppy as those kids were. They have better ideals about what they want to do with their lives. They seem to be aiming somewhere for the most part. I think these kids today are doing a lot better than they did in the 60s, really. So I don't see anything left over from the 60s that will affect these kids. That's it? Oh, my God.
Which countries at the moment have got the worst demographics? Which countries should be very concerned about the ratio of young to old?
The worst in the world is China. They've been in the process of updating their data over the course of the last couple of years, and they're now starting to publicly admit that they overcounted by 100 million people. All of those people would have been born since one child, so age 40 and under, the young worker demographic, the childbearing demographic, and 2/3 of them are probably women. So best guess is that China only has 1.3 billion people now. The population probably peaked more than 10 years ago, and by 2030 there will be more retirees than workers, and by 2050, the entire population of China will have dropped below 650 million.
That's wild.
It's beyond terminal. Yeah, so the Chinese system collapses this decade for sure. Assuming nothing else goes wrong, and there's plenty other competitors to put the bullet in China's head.
Dude, that is crazy. Okay, so...
Yeah, all the way from pre-industrial to post-industrial collapse in 45 years.
Just for the people that don't understand about how the one-child policy and the preference for boys over girls and stuff created this landscape, what's the high-level view of that?
Sure, well, there's two things. First of all, of course, is one child. Mao was concerned that they had a young upcoming generation after World War II that was going to eat the country alive. So they went to a two-child policy, ultimately to a one-child policy, and that was not loosened until 2015. But by that point, the damage was already done because there was a second factor. Remember, countries that industrialize later can follow the path of those who came before. They can skip some steps. So China was the fastest ever industrialization experience. What the United Kingdom did in 7 generations, the Chinese did in 1. And so they crammed 7 generations of economic growth and development in 1, and that's why their growth rate has been so impressive. But you can only do that once, and now it's behind them. And now they have no children, and they have very few people under age 45.
Is population growth and collapse similar to an R0 number in a way, that more people allow you to have more children, which gives you more people to have more children, but if the reverse is happening, then it causes a nosedive?
You're absolutely right there. Now, I don't want to say that unchecked population growth is necessarily the way to go. That's not what I'm after here. I mean, you require a balance between children, young workers, and mature workers. If you don't have enough mature workers, you don't have the capital. If you don't have enough young workers, you don't have the consumption. If you don't have the children, you don't have a future. China is already out of those last two categories. And so we know where this leads. It leads to 0.
Given the fact that humans are being, I think it's every 3 generations lives for another generation at the moment. Around about every generation lives 8 years longer than the generation before. Increased healthcare, health span, better access to...
That is only true in the shift from pre-industrial to industrial.
So you get that once?
Well, it depends upon how you apply the lessons to your system. In the case of Europe, I'd say they got it 3 times. But there's definitely an upper limit. One of the things to keep in mind, especially when you're talking about European demographics, is that in Europe, people are not living longer. Overall lifespan has not improved. What's improved is we've gotten rid of a lot of mortality. So the things that used to kill you when you were 0 to 65 don't kill you anymore.
Right, okay. That is going to change the shape of demographics as well, right? The fact that young people are able to get old more easily, say.
More safely,
yeah, precisely. So I guess there's just a lot over the last 100 years we've seen such change. It's not just been technological change, but downstream from that is what's happened demographically and how that's
populous country has hit an historic turning point. Today, China announced its first population decline in 6 decades. China's National Bureau of Statistics said the country had 850,000 fewer people at the end of last year than in 2021, bringing its total population to 1.4 billion. China's birth rate also hit a record low last year. And this marks a new milestone in China's deepening demographic crisis. To what can this decline be attributed?
Well, I mean, China's not unusual in having seen a population decline. Most modern nations where women are educated and have smaller families do see that. What's unusual about China is that this transition has occurred at a much accelerated speed. What takes most developed nations maybe 50 years to arrive at this point, China has arrived in 1 generation. And that's because of the one-child policy. And what this means is it's very unique in that not only does it have fewer people, it also has a very bad mix of fewer people in that a large portion of the population is very male, and that's because of the one-child policy. So the challenges for China growing ahead is that it will be hard for it to overcome this population decline because of these factors. The fact that it's a very wholly male, a hugely elderly population will make it much, much harder.
This new data came alongside the announcement of China's worst economic performance in nearly half a century. So what are the implications for China's economy?
Well, the population decline is one of the one of the economic headwinds that China faces. It's not the only one, but it is quite a difficult one to overcome. With a 1 in 4 of Chinese people will be a retiree by 2050. So the worker to retiree ratio is going to be huge, and some of the results of that will definitely impede economic growth. For example, pension shortfalls, huge public health implications, big economic implications for the growth markets. The kind of markets where we see innovation, where we see creativity are typically younger workforce markets and not elderly populations.
How concerned is the Chinese government about this decline and the potential impacts on Chinese society?
Very. I mean, in the most recent speech that Xi Jinping made, he actually talked about the need to talk about population and the need to support and grow population for the first time. And for Chinese leaders, where they make a lot of very oblique references, this was about as explicit as you made that. And of course, one of the very clear ways that we saw that the Chinese government is very worried about it is the sudden whipsawing of going from a one-child policy to a 2- and a 3-child policy in a relative span of just 5 years. The one-child policy was 30 plus years, and now we've gone 1, 2, 3 in just less than 5 years, 5-6 years.
So what then would a solution look like? Is it as simple as encouraging people to have more children?
No, it hasn't worked at all. I mean, they said, please have one. You went from having just one child to just one more, please, and then one more. And obviously, for the last 5 or 6 years, it hasn't worked. The solution, I think, will come in a variety of ways. Yes, incentives will have to be a part of it because China has, I think, more historically gone the disincentives routes, punishments, not rewards. And so they're starting to go in that route a little bit, but they need to be doing it a lot more. And the other part of it also is, I think, China is very unique because the population now is so very male and it's so very elderly. I mean, the statistic is if all of China's retirees were to form their own nation, they would be one of the world's top population rates after China and India, which is poised to overtake China now as the largest population. Then there would be senior China itself. And so these are very unique challenges for China that no other nation that's facing popular decline faces. And that's because of the one-child policy.